evening, everyone, and thank you, and welcome to the Union League Club of Chicago. My name is Dave Cohn. I'm the Executive Director of Public Affairs. It is my pleasant role this evening to welcome all of you to the club on behalf of the officers, directors, and members, and we are delighted tonight to present another installment of an ongoing series that we have presented for many years with our partners at the League of Women Voters of Chicago, Chicago in Focus. We are really delighted that you decided to spend some of your time today and this evening with us to hear from leaders in our community about important subjects important to us all. Before we get underway, I just wanted to take a brief moment to set a little bit of context here. For those who may not have attended these programs in the past, I want to tell you a little bit about the Union League Club of Chicago and why it is that we are partnering with the League of Women Voters on this program series. Ladies and gentlemen, you are gathered in the only private club in the United States with an institutional commitment to public policy advocacy and community service. The reason for that is tied to the club's founding. This club is the descendant of a movement that arose during the Civil War that called itself the Union Leagues of America. This was a movement of citizen patriots who were concerned about the threat posed to the young nation by the Civil War, and they decided to do something about it by forming this organization dedicated to helping President Lincoln defend the Union. That's where the Union in the Union League Club name comes from. Their primary occupation in that regard was raising money for the Union Army because, I know this will be a shock to many of you, but in 1862 there was no such thing as an income tax. What a wonderful time to be an American citizen, right? There was this little Civil War raging, but no IRS. President Lincoln did manage to institute a temporary income tax in 1863, but the point is, the Congress had very meager resources at that time to appropriate to the Union Army. So private citizens took up the slack. The Union League of America movement began to proliferate throughout the northern states, and at the height of the war in 1864, there were more than 1.5 million people affiliated with these Union League of America chapters across the northern states. When the war came to a close and the Union had successfully been defended, the Union League of America movement largely disbanded. Everyone went back to their daily lives. However, those who were active here in the Chicago area, which was near the birthplace of the Union League of America movement in Pekin, Illinois, decided they did not want to disband their fellowship. And so they kept meeting in the years after the war to talk about what they referred to as the sacred obligations of citizenship. And those sacred obligations included things like supporting those who serve in our nation's military to defend our constitutional liberties and our freedom, and also being engaged meaningfully in our democracy, not just showing up to vote, which they took as a given, but being informed citizens, being vigilant of those elected to serve us at the state, local, and federal level, being actively involved in supporting and sustaining what Dr. Franklin told us was a republic if you can keep it. So this club was founded with that in mind in 1879 to sustain and to inculcate those values in future generations. That is why for the last 140 years we've been engaged in a consistent program of community involvement, hosting programs like this to gather the community, to talk about those things that matter, and to learn from the leaders of our community and from one another. And so we're very grateful that you're here. I'm also very grateful that this all happened because it means I have this great job. It is the only private club where a refugee from government like me can work. So thank you to the founders of the Union League Club. Thank you very much. But tonight we're here to talk about some very serious matters involving the safety of our community and community policing, and we're delighted to have these distinguished panelists with us. And to introduce them, it is my pleasure to begin our program by introducing to you our moderator, Audra Wilson, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. Audra?
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
And thank you so much for being here. We have a wonderful crowd. I'm so honored to be here to moderate. And yes, we are here for a very, very important discussion. So thank you, Dave, and the Union League Club. So I know you've had a chance to read a little bit of the bios of our very illustrious guests. But what I like to do is I presume nothing in terms of people's knowledge. So I'm going to actually have you kind of introduce yourself a little bit to the crowd. because I think it's going to be very important to know a little bit about your backgrounds as we start to talk about some of these very important issues. We hear a lot about the challenges of community policing. We see a lot in the news, but again, presuming nothing, I think it's important for you to give some background and context for our discussion. So, Superintendent Johnson, I'm going to start with you. Could you just let folks know, what is your role entail as superintendent? Because I think that's something people don't necessarily know.
Okay, so as superintendent of the second largest police department in the country, I am responsible for about 13,400 sworn officers and a little over 3,000 civilian employees. And I guess you could, an analogy would be I'm the CEO of the Chicago Police Department. So I make policy and I am the bottom line when things go south on the department.
Good, thank you. And Dr. Neville, tell us in a nutshell what your background is.
Ooh, okay, in a nutshell. Let's see. I'm from Los Angeles, which I think is the best city. Sorry about that, Chicago.
Oh, it's okay.
Born and raised there. Received my PhD in counseling psychology from UC Santa Barbara. And then from there, in 1992, I joined the faculty at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and I was there for 9 years. And currently, for the past 18 years, I'm on faculty at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the departments of Educational Psychology and African American Studies. And I'm a professor there. I study race and racism, and my entire career has been involved with this. And I have a partnership with the Police Training Institute down at the University of Illinois, where we are working with police recruits to develop racial literacy and cultural empathy.
Thank you. So I'm going to start backwards for a second, Dr. Neville. So you mentioned being from Los Angeles. Now let's just delve down a little bit deeper. Tell us a little bit about kind of where you grew up and kind of your environment and kind of how that brought you to the studies that you're doing right now.
Okay, great. Let's see. I grew up when NWA was talking about stuff. I grew up when there was incredible friction between the LAPD and civilians. I grew up, was doing my internship, clinical internship, the year that Rodney King happened and witnessed that. So a lot of racial and ethnic strife within various different communities and tensions between the police department and the civilians. So that's a little bit about where I grew up and when I grew up. And I think just by purpose of being an African American woman in that society then and even today, was drawn to issues about racism because I experienced it so much in grad school and everyday life, and trying to unpack how do we deal with this. What does it mean at a structural level? How does it reproduce itself? And as a psychologist, are there things that we can do at an interpersonal level to make some changes as well? So,
great. Mm-hmm. And again, because I presume nothing, NWA was a gangster rap group. Just want to make sure you know. So, okay. So Superintendent Johnson, you are born and bred in Chicago.
Yes.
What I'd like for you to tell folks is talk about your own upbringing, your neighborhood, and kind of what it was like, because I think there are folks who aren't used to some of the communities or neighborhoods that you oversee, and I'd love for you to give them a little bit of a picture.
Okay, so yeah, I was born and raised in the city of Chicago. I've been a cop now for 31 years, but I started off in Chicago living in Cabrini Green housing, public housing complex, and Cabrini Green can be characterized as maybe the most notorious public housing development in the country. We moved from there when I was about 9 years old, but what I can tell you about that experience of being a little kid over there was, I think it's helped me now have an overarching perspective of racism in this city and the police-community relationships. If you all recall, back in the 70s, we had 2 police officers murdered over there, walking across a baseball field, and they were murdered by Johnny Veal. And what people don't know about me is we actually had a run-in with Johnny Veal when I was a little kid. And my dad, we lived on the 10th floor of one of the public housing buildings. So my dad would let us go down to the playground, but my parents were parents, man. And I mean, they had, I was the youngest of 6 boys, so they had their work cut out for them. But whenever they would let us outside, one of them would always watch us. And this particular day, myself and my brother, right over him, about 2 years older than me, we were on the playground playing in Johnnyville, just being a butt. He took out a torch, the kind of torches that you put down on the highway when you're having problems. He took out that torch and burned my older brother on the leg with the torch, just for no reason at all. He didn't know us, we didn't know him, but he did that. And so my dad was watching us, and he was downstairs in about 30 seconds. And that's when I really came to recognize how difficult, when you're in that kind of environment, you don't really realize how traumatic things can be, because you're just kind of living, especially as a kid. Children are very resilient, and we were. Now, years later, in retrospect, when I look back on some of the things that I saw over there, I realized that myself and probably my siblings went through trauma, and I'll kind of explain it a little bit more. But at that time, it was around Martin Luther King, when King was killed, and there was a lot of looting and burning going on over there in the Cabrini Green area. So my parents did the right thing and moved us away from that area, and we moved out to Washington Heights, which is around Morgan Park High School. And I have to be honest with you all, we thought as children we were actually living somewhere else, because it was that different. I came from public housing complex. We lived on the 10th floor, and every night, especially during the summer, what we experienced was gunfire every single night. And what would happen is the gangbangers would go up on the roof, which was right above our apartment, and they would fire back and forth at rival gangs or the police. So I will tell you this was before we knew what PTSD was. So at 9 years old, my parents moved us out to the South Side, right? And we right off the bat recognized how quiet it was. It was so quiet. But here's the rub. I, as a 9-year-old kid, I couldn't sleep at night. And my parents, they never took me to see anybody, but they kept trying to figure out why I was having problems sleeping. And my mom finally figured out, because I had become accustomed to the noise at night. So they bought me a radio, and I got hooked on Chicago Eddie Schwartz as a little kid. I don't know if you all remember him, but that, I learned a lot just from listening to that. So I would finally, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, finally doze off. But I would tell you all, those experiences, because I've been a victim of racism in this city, not just as a little kid, but I would tell you this about the community-police relationship. It kind of twists me sometimes when I hear the general phrase that the black community never trusted the police, and that's not true. I lived in a very volatile area at that time, and what I can tell you all is that it wasn't so much we didn't trust the police, we didn't trust certain police officers. But in general, we were okay with the police, because who do you call when you need help? So if we saw Officer Connery coming around the corner, all the kids would flock to this guy, because he was a white cop, but he treated you fairly, respectfully, and he was about community policing. Now, if we saw O'Shaughnessy coming around the corner, we knew, but that experience has helped me so much in becoming not just a cop, but now superintendent, because I get the chance to really affect people's lives and policy-making decisions. Because the simple fact and the simple truth is, the police cannot be the sole reason we get out of the violence that we see, not just in our city, but in our country. We can't police our way out of this. It takes the police and the community. And you all will often hear me say, the Chicago Police Department is only as strong as the faith that the community has in it. And that's true. So over these past few years that I've been superintendent, I have seen a cultural shift in how the Chicago Police Department conducts business.
Thank you. And I think your background is so important, and we're going to unpack a little bit more about what you discussed about trauma and essentially PTSD in our communities, and Dr. Neville will help us with that. Superintendent, I do want to throw this question at you, and then to you, Dr. Neville. So a lot of critics will use New York or Los Angeles as examples of cities with larger populations than Chicago, but lower rates of violence. And so my first question is it actually fair to make that comparison to Chicago? And what are some of the differences between Chicago and these other two cities that make that comparison perhaps not as fair or as accurate?
So no, it's not fair to compare the three cities. When you look at the national crime picture, you would think Chicago is the most violent city in this country, right? And that's simply not true. We're about in the middle of the pack, but we get so much attention because we're so big, and we get compared to New York and LA. So the reason it's not fair to compare us is, first of all, every city is unique. But when you look at Chicago compared to New York and LA, we're a lot more diverse than they are. So Chicago's demographics is split up: a third white, third black, and a third Hispanic. And their populations don't mirror that. Now, when you look at LA, LA is spread out. It's a huge population that's spread out. Chicago isn't spread out like that. We're in a dense urban environment. But when you look at New York, they're more vertical than we are. They're really up and down. So you have three unique dynamics going on, but it's not fair, in my opinion, to compare us. When I became a cop in 1988, and for years we mirrored our violent crime with New York and LA, and then they took a significant dip, and we stayed pretty steady. And then in 2016, of course, we spiked way up to numbers that we hadn't seen in quite a while. But in speaking to the police chiefs, they had certain things happen in both of those cities that we just haven't experienced in terms of people moving out, moving in, those types of things that we just haven't experienced here. But I think the diverse population for Chicago is more challenging. I think if you have populations that look like each other a lot of times, it's easier, because one of the things that I've learned as a cop is that I think one of law enforcement's flaws was that we oftentimes take people that aren't familiar with different cultures and put them into those cultures and then say, now police that culture. And the fact of the matter is, when you do that and people don't understand cultures, what they tend to do? Resist it. And I'll give you a quick anecdotal story. When I was a patrol officer, I was working in Stateway Gardens, and I had a white cop. And this guy, I worked with him quite a bit, and there was nothing that would indicate to me that this guy was racist. And when you grow up in racism, you can sniff a racist out 10 miles down the road. I don't care how they try to hide it. It just doesn't matter. You can sniff that out. So this guy, I didn't get that from him. So we get a domestic violence call. We go up to the 9th floor, and if you know anything about the projects back then, you didn't take the elevator up to go up the stairs. You really didn't, and there's reasons why. So we walked up the stairs, so we're already kind of winded when we get up there. But when we get in there, there's a mother and father and 3 teenage kids, and they're domesticated. I mean, a real good one, too. So when we get there, we're trying to calm the situation down, and they get loud, really loud, as they're walking towards us. And my partner, who's standing about right there, he sees them coming at us, the 2 big teenage boys, and he puts his hand on his gun. And so I clamped down on it, and I just shook my head to him. I got this, don't worry about it. And I kept my hand right there and brought the situation, way down. When we got out to the squad car, he was like, man, Eddie, I thought they were getting ready to attack us. And I said, dude, black people talk loud, man. That's how we communicate. But it occurred to me he didn't know that cultural difference. He thought their loud tone of voice was because they were aggravated with us. They were aggravated with each other. We had nothing to do with the aggravation, but he mistook that. And that's why it's so important that we train our officers up for the different cultural differences they're going to face in a diverse city like Chicago.
So Dr. Neville, I want you to pick up on that too, because obviously training is a big part of your background. Talk about why it is so important, especially when we're talking about structural racism, when the superintendent's talking about, I could smell racist, you know, I've experienced this firsthand. Why is this such an important thing when it comes to training officers?
Thanks a lot for asking the question, and I just want to acknowledge ahead of time that I know I'm going to say something that's going to offend somebody. I'm going to be a lot more controversial and direct because we're dealing with a very complex topic when we talk about racism. So I have a few different opinions and thoughts, and hopefully we can engage in dialogue in that. And while I think that part of the issue, I appreciate the notion that I can sniff out a racist, I think the assumption there is that all racism is overt. Or that people say things that are incredibly overt or what would be explicitly called racist. And I think since probably the civil rights movement, we know that expressions of racism have morphed into different kinds that's coded. But we haven't moved away from these messages that are out in the media and in society about who Black people are, who Asian Americans are, who white folks are, these ideas about racial superiority and inferiority. So I'm not surprised that this person is threatened by Black folks. It might be that he doesn't know African American culture. I think that's part of it. And it might be that he's been bombarded with messages that Black men are violent. And we know that the majority of Black men are not violent, but if those are the only messages that you get, you internalize that, and I think that's part of this larger racial structure, one. But two, I've got a whole decades of research that I've been looking at on this idea about colorblind racial ideology. And there's a couple ways that you can think about colorblindness. One is the way that most folks talk. I don't notice what race you are. I don't see what race you are. I just see people as human beings. And then there's another way of looking at colorblindness is I don't see racism. Racism doesn't have anything to do in society. I don't acknowledge that. So these different types of denial. Not to bore you with all the details that I kind of get geeked out about. Bottom line, though, is that we found that people who say, I don't notice what race you are, and racism is a thing of the past, it doesn't have anything to do with now, I'm this really good person, that those are ideal kind of beliefs if we lived in an ideal world. And we don't. We live in a world that is racially stratified, unfortunately. And what we have found time and again through all of our research, not just mine, but other people who write in this area, is that those people who say, I don't see race or racism, actually hold the most virulent racial prejudice and intolerance. So I can imagine being with someone who says, I just see you as a human being. My red flag, my antenna goes up, because those are the ones who haven't questioned things. So just to be acknowledged that race looks and racism looks different. So you asked about the whole issue about training, and I think that's incredibly important. My approach to looking at working with, whether I'm working with college students, working with therapists to be sensitive to folks in the room, or working with police recruits, is to have them begin to gain some racial literacy to question this belief that racism doesn't matter. Because what we have found in our research, that if people say that racism doesn't matter, they don't have empathy for the folks that they're working with. And it's that empathy that's important to humanize who we're seeing and who we're working with. So I can talk all day about that, but let me leave some space for some other dialogue.
Absolutely. No, thank you. And we will have some time left for some Q&A, because I know this is a very bright and inquisitive audience, and they're going to definitely have some questions. I want to talk a little bit more technically about some of the specific gun violence problems that we are having. And unfortunately, this kind of goes with something you were saying, Professor Neville, in our communities. We just heard, and for those of you who are not living in the city, most recently, an 11-year-old, or actually someone who just turned 12, who died on her 12th birthday, who was shot in her home the day before her birthday, and just struck by a bullet that was not intended for her, as most are not intended for the victims. And I raise that as an important issue because we talk a lot about police and community relations, And which sometimes in Chicago we hear a lot about violence by police officers against African Americans and Latinos. But the thing that we don't necessarily like to talk about is violence within our own communities. And so what I'd like you to just to mention or talk about briefly is, how do we have a conversation about what's happening within our own neighborhoods when there is violence being committed against members of our own neighborhood?
So, okay, great. Thank you for asking that question. And I'm just tearing up now hearing that story. It's incredibly sad. My heart goes out to the family. I remember one of the hardest things I've ever had to do as a faculty member is to attend the funeral of one of my advisees' brother, who was shot and killed in Chicago by a stray bullet. He was a twin. He was killed in front of his brother. It was heart-wrenching to be there. It was heart-wrenching for her to go through the trial and to have conversations about this. So I know that's incredibly painful. I think these conversations that we must have, I think there's internal conversations within our communities to have these without a gaze from folks outside. I think that there's ways that we have been dehumanized in society. There's ways in which racialized poverty impacts us. And that the trauma that can have on folks that need serious discussion without pathologizing people. I don't think what's going on in our communities is any different than what's going on in poor communities around the country, regardless of race. So I don't want to sensationalize it. But some of the specific things that I think are important just for Black folks is, one, to hold space for those people who have been traumatized by gun violence and related violence. We've been doing some research where we've been talking to teens about what's the most important thing in your community that you think is critical, and whether talking to people in Chicago or talking to people in Champaign, gun violence is number one. And what they want, what the kids want, is a space to talk about it, to have an opportunity to describe and bear witness to their pain. I think providing those kinds of things are important. What they talk about are lack of internship opportunities that create and fester this, lack of programs that are geared toward things. So I think that it's complex, and we need to provide space to look at the complexities, not only in terms of what gun violence is, but the adverse effect of gun violence. So I think those are some of the things. And the last point that I think is important is this whole notion. I'm a psychologist, and I'm interested in ideas about racial identity. And that might seem kind of trivial to people who don't study it. But what we know, what the research actually suggests, is that when Black folks and Latinx folks have a sense of racial pride in their ancestors' accomplishments and who they are as racial and ethnic beings, that is actually helpful for them to navigate environments such as those with high gun violence. It actually is related to them not participating in gun violence. They've got some recent research that looked at people through the re-entry process. So once they were released from jail or prison, that they found that those who have a sense of pride did better. They had lower recidivism rate. They were contributing to their communities. So this notion is, if I have a sense of who I am and I know our contributions, they're more willing to give back and protect the community. So in terms of just one intervention, I think that would be it. And just one quick anecdote. I remember talking at the Danville Correctional Facility, providing a workshop on Black racial identity. And we were together for 3 hours, and they did some readings. And after that, they were saying, if I had this before, I would have known not to be out there. I could have helped some other child. I could have done some things differently. So we need to have conversations and safe spaces in within our communities to begin to explore that, as well as a whole bunch of other structural stuff.
Thank you. And that's why I had started with Superintendent Johnson talking a little bit about his background, and which I think plugs directly into that. He had the opportunity to move from an environment and see something different and have a strong parental unit, and what a big difference that makes. Superintendent, I want to ask you now a little bit more technical questions about gun violence and mitigating gun violence. So obviously, as the individuals who have the most direct interaction with members of the community, rightly or wrongly, Chicago Police Department receives the brunt of the criticism for failing to curb or to mitigate gun violence. But can you talk a little bit about the role that the criminal justice system plays in violent offenders that are on the streets?
Sure. So, so listen, we do get a lot of heat about trying to curb or mitigate violence, and I think that's an unfair expectation, because the police shouldn't listen. Crime, violence is a complex issue. You know, there's mental health issues, job opportunities, educational opportunities. There's a lot of things that go into preventing crime, and until we start to address those things, we'll keep spinning our wheels about it, because the simple fact of it is, you know, we have 120,000 documented gang members, self-admitted gang members in the city of Chicago. 120,000. Now, President Trump declared a national emergency when he found out there was 13,000 MS-13 members in New York, which is a little comical to me. But we have 120,000 here. And I would tell you all this. But I'm sorry, what was that question before I get off on a tangent?
I was saying, how about the criminal justice system? So what role does that play?
Oh, no wonder I forgot what it was. Okay, so the criminal justice system plays a large part in this, but let me put this in context. In the black and brown communities, and I've spent a lot of time in those communities, the community itself plays a large part in that. You know, I think as black people, we have to recognize and acknowledge when we have issues in our own communities and start to address those. Because what I see in the city of Chicago is individuals from anywhere from 14 years old to maybe 18 driving a lot of our gun violence. And I don't know anybody 14 years old that's able to support themselves and they have their own home or apartment. So the point to that is the parents or whoever lives in those homes with these kids, that has to be the first place that it starts. The criminal justice system, so listen, I know you all have heard a lot over the past few months about me, Mayor Lightfoot, and President Preckwinkle and Kim Foxx fighting about judicial reform. So let me be clear. I believe in judicial reform. I do think black people were disproportionately arrested, especially with the failed war on drugs. So I'm not a fan of mass incarceration or things of that nature. I do believe in bail reform, because I don't think just because you're poor and you steal a loaf of bread, you should sit in jail for the next 6 months pre-trial until you can come up with $100. If you had $100, you wouldn't have to steal that loaf of bread. So come on now, let's use some common sense. But what I will say is this. Violent offenders, I think as a collaborative group, myself, the mayor, state's attorney, and the county board president, we have to recognize that we have to treat violent offenders a bit differently. I don't think they should sit and rot away in jail either. But there has to be a consequence, because we have to create a mental culture that this is the wrong thing to do. We also have to provide people resources before they get themselves into that situation. But see, for me, I'm kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, because I've seen friends of mine get caught up in this system, relatives of mine get caught up in this system. So I'm acutely aware of that. But from the time I made district commander until now being superintendent, when I go to these homes or out on these crime scenes, and these victims' parents, mothers or fathers, come to me just devastated because their son or daughter has been a victim of gun violence, when I hear other people advocate for the person that shot them more than that victim, I have to take a step back and say, well, wait a minute. This guy that's lying in the gutter with a hole in his head, he didn't get a choice in the matter. The person that pulled that trigger, for whatever reason, he made that choice. He still made that choice. And so I think that the judicial system has a responsibility to look at the offense and look at the person's background before we just put them back out on the street. Because if they're a violent offender, there's no guarantee that they won't be violent again. And again, like I said, I'm for bail reforms. I just think we have to be smarter and talk about what that should look like. And reporters always try to pin me against a wall and say, well, okay, if you think they should pay a bond, what do you think it should be? 10,000, 20,000? I don't know. I don't know. But I will tell you this, having dealt with gangs, and make no mistake about it, organized gangs, this organized crime, and they're no dummies. You have a lot of individuals that are involved in that lifestyle that could be CEOs of Fortune 500 companies if they chose that route in life. So all I'm saying is the criminal justice system needs to do a risk assessment of these individuals, and I'll give you one anecdotal story about that, and hopefully it'll kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So we routinely work with the ATF and our federal partners. And anyway, we had one guy that was selling guns to the police. Okay, we had undercover police officers buying weapons from this guy. So he was on his way to another buy with us, because we do several of them to make our case stronger when we get to court. He's on his way to sell weapons to the undercover police officer, and he never makes it. He didn't make it. We didn't know why, so the next day he calls our undercover officer, and we find out that some other Chicago police officers stopped this guy and arrested him. He had 4 AK-47s in his vehicle, 4 assault weapons, right? We lock him up, he goes to court. The prosecutors ask for a stiff bond. The judge lets this guy out on home monitoring. He calls our undercover officer when he gets out. Now remember this, while he was in jail, folks don't believe this, but when you're in jail, we actually monitor your phone calls out to the public. He calls and he's laughing about the criminal justice system because he thought it was a joke that the judge was letting him out that easily. Now he's telling this undercover officer that. So he gets out, he makes another buy with us, or another sale. He sells us some more guns, and this guy thinks that the criminal justice system is a joke. So he has no fear of the consequence of his actions. And when you look at a guy that's selling, when he has 4 AK-47s, I think this guy is a public safety risk. I do. And when I talk to people that live in those communities, they're begging me to do something about that. So the criminal justice system does have a role to play, just like the police and the community. So like I said, I'm not criticizing them as much as saying we need to get together in collaboration and figure out what's the best way to attack it. Because I'll tell you this, when you have a person in your gang that's a shooter for the gang, most guys don't have the stomach to do that, to walk up to somebody and kill them. They just don't. So the few that they do have that are willing to do that, when we arrest them, guess what that gang does? And I'm just being honest with you. They pool their money together and bail this guy out because he's the most important person after the top guy in that gang. So, where we land in terms of what should be the bottom line for these type of individuals, I don't know, but I think we just have to talk about that and get to that point.
Thank you. So I know we are running short on time and we're going to have some questions. Dave is going to have the microphone. Before we jump into our questions, I just want to throw something out. Dr. Neville, I'm going to have you start with this and then open it up to the audience to continue this line of questioning. But a little bit about improvement of the police-community relations. So as you talked about sort of the importance of training, you talked about some of the dynamics in the community. What do you think are some of the essential things to be able to improve those relationships between police officers and the communities they serve?
Oh, okay, great. I think I like the idea of reconsidering and thinking through and looking at best practices for citizen review boards because that allows the community to be involved with taking a look at police misconduct conduct when that happens, that these review boards should be transparent and have community members who are most affected by violence represented there. I think that can help. But I also think community policing kinds of strategies that are well known, that folks live in the community in which they serve, that folks are out on the beat, like you said, if you knew Officer so-and-so who you might have played basketball with, who you might have had this, so that there are human connections and relationships with people. I think that's really important. Working with neighborhoods and communities and having dialogue and discussions, I think, important. So the more we can humanize one another, to listen to one another, to hear one another's perspective, to do some perspective taking, I think is really important. But also that the community feels not only that they're heard and listened to, but that they play a role in holding the police also accountable for some things, just as the police hold the community accountable. But so those are a few things that I have.
Okay. So we'll have some audience questions. We only have two ground rules, ladies and gentlemen. One is I hold the microphone. The other is that we ask that you pose your question in the form of a question. Okay, great. So let me see how many questions we can get in.
One of the concerns is that people who will go to those community meetings become targets from the gang members that see them go to those meetings. How do you cure that?
Did you want to?
No, go ahead.
You know more about gangs than I do.
Well, I would tell you this. Since I was a district commander, people have posed that question to me. And to be quite honest, I haven't seen a real issue with people attending community policing meetings being a target of anything. But in fairness, I will tell you this. I know that we have to do a better job as law enforcement and our judicial system of ensuring people, when they see violent crimes especially occur, that we'll do everything we can to protect them going through the judicial process. Because, I mean, think about this for a moment. You're on your block and you witness someone shoot and kill someone else. And you know the victim of the crime as well as the perpetrator of the crime. And you know that that perpetrator also knows you and your family. And you know you have no place else to go but right there. That's it. You know, we can offer you relocation, but this is where you've lived your entire life. You are not moving. So you have to make that decision in terms of, do you cooperate or do you not cooperate? And, you know, the issues we have in Chicago right now is twofold. First of all, if you don't have the trust that you need in that community, in other words, if that person doesn't already trust the police, they're going to be more reluctant to give the police the information we need to successfully prosecute this person. And at the second token, if they know that that guy, if they do come forward and testify, and that person has a huge possibility of getting right back out on the street, that's going to make you reluctant to give the information also. So I just think as a society, we have to do better with those types of things. And dialogue is the best way to get to that solution. And that's why I always ask community residents and officers, what do they think about a problem? What do they think a fair solution is before I tell them what I'm actually thinking?
Okay, next question over here to your left, folks.
Hi, Pamela Stauffer. I'm a graduate of the Citizens Police Academy. And one thing that came up during the 10-week course was that there are CAPS personnel who you can't find them, they don't respond, they don't, phone calls, emails. And what is the criteria for a CAP sergeant? Who gets to pick them?
So the CAP sergeant is actually the responsibility of the district commander to choose that particular male or female. But I tell you this, if you all didn't know this, when I became superintendent, I went all over this country looking at best practices because I knew we just had to do things better. In the 90s, when CAPS first started, Chicago rolled that out, and we were the model agency for CAPS, and it fell off, and a lot of that was because of funding. You have to do different things, or the attrition on the department, we had to put those officers back out on the street. So what I'll tell you is this, I went to New York in 2016, and they had a program which I really liked called a district collaboration officer. And it's kind of CAPS, but it's not. It's more of those officers dedicated to that particular program. They do nothing but go into that community 24/7. They have a cell phone that's issued to them, and those people that live in those communities have 24/7 access to those police officers. So we started a pilot program on the northwest side in February, and the statistics in terms of calls for service and citizens reaching out, those officers in this short amount of time have fielded 20,000 calls. And you're talking about 10 officers and one sergeant, 20,000 calls. Their calls for service in that district have went down. Their radio assignments pending has went down, and their crime has went down. So I think it's called the DCO program here, the District Coordinating Officer. And we're thinking about replicating that in districts throughout the city. CAPS, I think, suffered because we didn't hold everybody accountable like we should have. It was more of a strategy. Now in the Chicago Police Department, it's a philosophy, because every officer does and should be engaging in community policing. So the short answer to your question is the district commander ultimately chooses that person, but we're kind of looking at this other pilot program to see, because we're always looking at ways to better build that relationship with the community.
Okay, next question is over here, sir.
Margaret Herring. I have a question about the criminal code. The marijuana revisions that were recently enacted provided an opportunity for people to petition to have low-level criminal convictions expunged. Mm-hmm. My question is, would you support a review of the criminal code to eliminate those kinds of charges, particularly from the perspective of the fact that when people are charged, they are often charged with many different crimes, mm-hmm. and it becomes a coercive means of securing a guilty plea?
Okay, so from a police perspective, our job is to enforce the law, whatever that law may be. Now, I know State's Attorney Kim Foxx has made arrangements to expunge, because marijuana becomes legal in Illinois 1st of January 2020. So at that point, anything before that time, depending on the amount, I think it's under 30 grams, they're eligible to have it expunged. I think that when you expunge someone's history, you have to look at the totality of what it is. But the simple fact of it is, if the law has passed, then if they're saying anything under 30 grams is now becoming legal, then they have a right to get those records expunged. They really do. And I think the Black community and Hispanic community suffered a lot from the failed war on drugs, and I saw that firsthand. I don't want to go back to that. But in terms of having records expunged, I think if the law says this is what it is, then that's what it is.
Okay. Okay, we'll continue the sidebar after the forum. Let's get to another question here.
Hello, Superintendent. Question for you. I work a lot in different communities that were formerly public housing communities. They are now mixed income. So you have a lot of different ethnic backgrounds of income people that live within the community. Mm-hmm. And what I found is that people, they have the same issues, but they won't work together around those issues. It's a us versus them. And also, in a lot of the meetings that I host with tenants, I say to them, these are your children, your sons, your daughters, your husbands, your nieces, nephews, grandchildren that are out here. How do you get to a point where we can get families to understand that it's so crucial for them to be responsible, or to say to those loved ones, you're causing an ill in our community? How do you, we have community policing in our communities, but yet it still don't trickle down to the families being trustworthy enough to step up to their own child, their own family mm-hmm. member, and say, hey, stop.
You know what? That is a great question, and if I had the absolute answer, I'd be a billionaire. I really would, because we struggle with that same thing. So this is what I would say to you all about something like that. When I became a cop in 1988, we kind of knew our mission was crystal clear. We just enforced the law and locked up the bad guy, people that broke the law. Now, law enforcement has morphed into having to deal with all the societal ills that you can think of. So we have to rethink how we do things. And I would tell you this, and there are veteran cops that would strangle me for saying what I'm about to say. But
Okay, everybody take out their notepads.
we just simply have to look at things differently. I don't think poor people should be victimized by the system because they're poor. So in saying that, what I'm saying to you is this. You asked me, how do we get people to recognize they have to step up to their own family members and talk about the pain and trauma that you're causing, right? Do a lot of you all remember Robin Robinson, the TV news anchor? Well, she was one of my first big hires when I became police superintendent because I knew we had to do things differently. Robin might have been a little bit more liberal than I would have wanted, but I needed a different point of view, a different perspective. And she gave that to me. And she would just be jumping up and down to hear me say what I'm about to tell you all. But the concept of restorative justice, I believe in it. Because I think that when you get the people that perpetrated crime, especially family members, and they sit down and tell them how you made me feel, yeah, you stole this from me, and this is what that did to me. Grandma gave me that. You took it from me. You took a piece away from me. Because I think when people do things like that, they don't think about the trauma that they cause to the victim of that particular crime. So I think that's one of the methods that we have to start utilizing to make the person that inflicted that harm on you, however big or small it is. Because some things seem big to me but might not seem big to you, and vice versa. So I think the way that we get there is to talk about it and have whoever committed that offending act, I think the victim needs to be able to share with that person in a non-invasive environment. She hosts cafes now with the police and communities, and I got to tell you, it's been very successful. And cops that I've had community members come to me as superintendent and say, I think that's a racist cop. When those people sit down in these cafes, that's what she calls them, and they talk about what's going on with each other, some of the cops that people thought were the most racist in CPD, they came away with a different attitude because now they find out more about that person personally, and the pain and the trauma that inflicts on both sides is now exposed. So I think that's one method we can utilize to get to that
Can
point.
I also respond to that?
Jump in, please.
Okay, great. Just a quick question. I'm excited about the cafes that are being offered, and I think that's really innovative. I just would like to maybe perhaps shift some of the discussion. Many times the gaze is blaming families themselves for things and perpetuating some of the crimes, and I actually think that many families are probably talking to their kids. There's very few people who would just let their child be out there and not be concerned and not have these conversations. So I don't want to blame families because I think poor families are blamed so much for everything in their community. The other thing is, earlier we talked about trauma, and I do think understanding trauma-informed care is absolutely critical because probably folks who are living in these poor neighborhoods experience trauma, whether it's hearing the gunfire at night and having their children go out and you don't know if they're going to come home, and their own trauma history of either sexual abuse or these other things. And so how are we providing trauma care to these folks? And the way that post-traumatic stress, because you had mentioned that earlier, it looks like depression, being on pins and needles, not being able to sleep at night, but it also can come out in interpersonal kind of relationships. So just wanted to shift some of the conversation away from blaming poor people.
Yeah, and we're nearing the end of our time. I think we have time for maybe one more question here, ma'am. Don't be nervous. You get the last question.
just really quickly, the impression most people get is that when you read the papers, look at TV, the word gangs equals Black and Hispanic. Are there gangs in other communities that are not Black and Hispanic? And I just want to say, in the 15th district, I was there for National Night Out, and the relationship that the people in that community have with the policemen there was just totally opposite. Is that a best practices area that you're working with?
It is. 15th District, Austin community on the west side is one of our real success stories, where the police and the community members are really working together. You know, and for me as superintendent, that's been one of my biggest priorities, is to change the way the police and the communities interact. Because I know there's been a lot of bad blood. And look, it really baffles me when people ask me, do I think there's racism in the Chicago Police Department? Come on now. There's racism all across this country. So we have 13,000 sworn members. You think some of them are not racist? Because the answer is yes, they are. Racism, remember, I grew up on the tail end of the civil rights movement. So I know what that looks like. You know, and I tell my son now, the racism that I experienced as a kid, you might not, but don't be mistaken. Racism is alive and well. It's just covert now. Back then, it was cool to be racist. It's not like that anymore, but it's still there, and it hides in all kind of different forms. But in terms of your question, are there other gangs? Of course there are. It's just that in Chicago, we don't experience, we have just a handful of white gangs, and they're very quiet. But you go to our surrounding areas, you know, when I talk to chiefs around the country, they don't have a lot of problems with their Black and brown communities. They have the issues with their white communities. You know, that's why the narrative that police only, and I hate to bring this up, but it's the reality of our world. When you hear that police only shoot Black people and brown people, that's not true. The majority of police-involved shootings occur with white people. You know, it's just that you don't hear about it much. But because of the demographics of our city and where our poor populations are, that's where you're going to have the most rub. I don't think, you know, millionaires have issues with, you know, trying to find something to eat. You know, how do you pay the rent? You know, and remember, a lot of these individuals involved in that lifestyle are doing it because they don't know another pathway to take. If we could show them another path, a lot of them would take it. So we just have to do better as a society of remedying that type of thing.
And ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize for not having more time for questions. Perhaps our panelists will be willing to stick around and have some more dialogue with you, but I think it is instructive that we have these two community leaders and the superintendent in particular take time to come and talk with us about these important matters. Can we please have a round of applause for our panelists and superintendent? And also, let us recognize our wonderful moderator, Audra, from the League of Women Voters. We thank you very much. And we have a short presentation. I would like to invite to come up to the stage the president of the League of Women Voters of Chicago, Annie Logue. Annie, we have a couple of things to give. Audra, thank you so much. What a terrific moderator, right?
Yes.
Wow.
I want to thank Audra, and I want to thank Superintendent Johnson, and I want to thank Dr. Neville. We have Starbucks gift cards from the League.
See, we've worked this out. The League of Women Voters gives them the Starbucks gift cards, and we give them these lovely Union League Club coffee mugs.
Yeah.
And by the way, I want to mention for the benefit of Superintendent Johnson that this is well below the gift limit that you are permitted to accept. So, sir, we thank you. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for coming to the Union League Club of Chicago tonight. We hope you have a great night. We are adjourned.